Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Lewis Tait. I'm glad to have you here tonight on this 31st day of March, the last day of March 2021. I hope that you've been safe today, had a good day. Probably you worked, maybe you're from home or you're commuting or what have you. And let's hope that you had a good day and that you've got some things done. So for the next few moments, ask you to get something perhaps to write with, get your favorite um, beverage, and just be present in the moment. That's all I ask you to do. Just to be present in the moment so that we can just absorb. Sometimes we got so many things going on. This is a great time for us to just um, kind of learn something, to think about some things, particularly as it relates to the Bible and our sort of theological understanding. Theological understanding just means how we understand God, how we understand spirituality, how that interacts, how do we see God, see ourselves in the world, how do we understand God. So I'm glad y'all are jumping on. Good to see you, Brenda Perry. So what I want y'all to do, and Deacon Charlie, thank you because you do it every week, is to take the opportunity, if you have an iPhone, is that you go down to the bottom of your page and it says share. And you go to share. If you have a group you want to share it to, you can do that if it's a public group. Or you can send it in Messenger, where you probably have people that you are connected to. So all I want you to do is give me a thumbs up or give me some hearts when you have done that. Try to invite at least 5 people to attend. And you can't go chasing them. You just invite them and they can decide whether or not they want to sort of hang in there with us or not. So that's all you have to do. And we're on YouTube. We are on my Facebook page. We're also on the church's Facebook page, which is The Village, and also Twitter, my Twitter account. So there are several ways people can watch and be engaged. And of course, if you have questions, you can always put those questions in the comments, and I'll try to get to them. Or even if you want to make a statement, you can put them in the comments. All right. So let's pray, and we're going to get started, get right on into it. God, we are grateful for another day, another just a time where we could experience life again, to breathe, to move about, to eat food or to drink water, to just be able to take care of ourselves. So tonight we are absolutely grateful. We pray, God, for this people, friends who are struggling, perhaps even some of us. Uh, During this pandemic, people are experiencing a myriad of emotions. There have been a lot of people who have passed. There have been people who have survived. There have been so many different political and uh, conspiratory theories floating around. But one thing we can be sure of, that you are still God, and there's no match for who you are. So we trust you tonight, and we're learning to trust you in the midst of all the things that are happening. So bless our time tonight together as we study. Uh, May something open up that will help us to live better, to be better in the world, to find a way to be persons who are change agents and fight for justice, and also find ways to love ourselves and love other people. This is my prayer. In your son's name, Yahshua, Jesus the Christ. Amen. All right. I'm glad to be here with you tonight. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Esther. We are back in the book of Esther. We'll stay there for a while. We're in Esther chapter 2, and verses 12 through 23. But tonight we'll probably pay more attention to verses 19 through 23. But I want you to make sure you start to read these texts, because sometimes you can read a verse, and if you don't understand the context of which that verse is coming out of, you can take that one verse out of context. And so it's important you kind of understand, the story of the book of Esther, and its possibilities for your life and my life in terms of the lessons that we can learn. All right, so let's just read. Let's I'm going to paraphrase the verses 12 through 18, but basically, Esther now, she has won the favor of Haggai the eunuch, and now these women, it explains the beauty treatments that they're getting. Treatments for women lasted a year, tells us in verse 12, and massages of oil of myrrh for 6 months, and oil of balsam for 6 more months, and each woman would be taken in turn to King Xerxes. And when she went from the harem to the palace, she could wear whatever she wanted. So in a sense, it's kind of it's telling us, well, she's going to see this king. This is not something. This is not a beauty contest that she entered into on her own. They were gathered out. They were gathered. All these women from all the provinces around the empire, brought against their will because they didn't have any say so, perhaps, over what was going on. But it's saying, it's kind of giving us sort of this human side. She could wear whatever she wanted. That's very interesting. So she would go in the evening, and the next morning she would be taken to another harem and put in care of Shazgaz, who's another eunuch in charge of the king's concubines. She would not go to the king again unless he liked her enough to ask her by name. So the time came when Esther had to go to see the king. That's King Xerxes. Ahasuerus is also his name. And the time came for Esther to go to the king. Esther, then it explains again, her background. Her mother's name was Abihail, and the cousin of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his daughter. Esther, admired by everyone who saw her. When her turn came, she was just what Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the harem, advised her to wear. So she wore what he told her to wear. So now the story is kind of giving us this kind of example of, it seems like, Esther is pliable. That means that she is not, she's not making things difficult. She's taking advice, but that doesn't mean, as some people like to translate, that she's a weak woman. It just means, I think she's just surveying the land. She's sort of figuring out, what she needs to do in order to survive. Right now, she doesn't know anything about being a spy, nor is she's coming there to be a spy. She's just Esther right now. And you got to think about it. She's like 16 or 17 years old. And so she's just learning how to survive. And so in Xerxes, it was in the 7th year as a king, in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, and Esther was brought to King Xerxes in the royal palace. And the king liked her. And more than any of the other women, it says, and more than any of the others, she won, again, listen to this, she won his favor and affection. So again, Esther, you have to look at her more in depthly and say, well, it wasn't that he just, found favor. She won his favor. And so she had to have some intellect, some intuition. She had to be smart in order to win a king's favor, someone she doesn't know. She's not a Persian. She is absolutely a Hebrew. She's a Jewish young woman. So she has to have some intuition, intellect, and of course, yes, she was attractive. But sometimes we want to also look at, we will make these negative comments about women, particularly women who are attractive, and we say they sort of make their way, or they get promoted because of the way they look. And that's not always true. And that's really a very, this sort of a negative way and stereotypical way of putting a person in a box based on their outer sort of looks, and say they got that position because it looks. Well, she did something. We don't know. The text doesn't tell us how she won his favor, because there were you understand, she wasn't the only woman. You think about that. In some harems, there were 1,000 women, and there were several harems. So she had to have something that she was doing, and not just, I know people's mind will go straight to sexual. No, I think that this woman really understood, how to get to this woman. And yes, Elder Jack, you could definitely have beauty and brains. I like that. And so then it says in verse 8, then the king, he said he placed, he liked the one of so he placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. All right. So now you've got this juxtaposition between Queen Vashti and now Queen Esther. And so people always want to make them sort of so different, but to me, they are the different sides of the same coin. In other words, they had a different approach of how they were dealing with this particular king, and also it gives us a model of how we can deal when we're in the empire. All right. And so then verse 18, it says, then the king gave a banquet in Esther's honor and invited all his officials and administrators, and proclaimed a holiday for the whole empire and distributed gifts worthy of a king. So you see, you see this juxtaposition, because when he was inviting Vashti, he was bringing her there only wearing a crown. In other words, to show her off, but he basically was disrespecting her and treating her as an object. Now it seems as if, even though, remember, Esther doesn't have a lot to say so about even coming to the palace. But it seems, because sometimes we can say, well, he seems to be treating her a little bit better, and perhaps. But remember, it's not something she came on her own. This wasn't a beauty pageant she went out and registered and signed up and came to her own. No, they were gathered up from around the provinces. So she was come, but she won his favor. Now let's pay attention as I want to look at these verses, particularly 19 through 23. It says, because Mordecai sort of shows up in this scene, and meanwhile Mordecai had been appointed by the king to administrative position. Now that's just very interesting, because we don't know how he just showed up. And Mordecai is a Jew, and all of a sudden now he's appointed by the king to an administrative position. And as for Esther, she is still not, that let it be known that she was Jewish. Verse 20, Mordecai had told her not to tell anyone, and she obeyed him in this, and just as she had obeyed him when she was a little girl. So the emphasis is here that she's doing the same kind of obedience that she was doing when she was a little girl under his care. During the time of Mordecai held office in the palace, Bigthana and Teres, two of the palace eunuchs who guarded the entrance to the king's rooms, became hostile to the king Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. Mordecai learned about it and told Queen Esther, who then told the king what Mordecai had found out. There was an investigation. It was discovered that the report was true, so both men were hanged on the gallows. The king ordered an account of this to be written down in the official records of the empire. So listen, have you noticed, though, other oppressed people who are near you, who are around you? Let me help you understand. Have you noticed people around you who not only look like you, but are similar circumstances like you? You may not be poor. You may not be outdoors, you may not be homeless, but sometimes you see people and you observe their life and you notice that their lives sort of mirror what your life is. But in this instance, people who are suffering, a lot of times we don't really know that they're suffering, because they're almost suffering in silence. And they don't always tell people or share with people what they're going through. But when you look at these stories, there's connections that you see in how people are functioning in this society that we're observing tonight, this Persian society. Remember, though, Esther's parents, I don't want us to get lost in this, her parents died. All right? You got to think about this. Her parents died. It doesn't text us and tell us if she had any siblings, other sisters and brothers. Her parents died. Then she was adopted, right? And before she was adopted, she was an orphan itself. So she probably was in the orphanage for a minute. We don't know how long she was in the orphanage, but you can imagine if you're in the orphanage, you were by yourself. You're a young girl, probably, early teens, probably at the moment, 2-3 years before maybe Mordecai shows up, because the text just writes it, but it doesn't give us a time frame. So you think about this. Her parents have died. Now she is on her own. She is Jewish in a Persian empire. And can you imagine what it would be like for a child to wake up yourself and your parents are gone, and then you're by yourself, and you are a ward of the state, if you will. And that's what Esther was living. And I can't even imagine, how she felt. She had to have fear. She had to feel like she had been abandoned. Sometimes you're younger, you don't understand death and dying. And also we don't really understand how it affects people. Everybody is affected differently when a parent dies, particularly when you are younger. So this had to be painful for her as a young girl to be in the orphanage, and then she's adopted by her uncle Mordecai. All right, and so we don't know like how long she's known him, or what. Besides that, it says that he's her uncle. But you and I both know you can go to family reunions or family gatherings that we have that we call family reunions, and you can meet an uncle or a cousin that you've never met before and don't really have that great a relationship with them. And you also can live close to some of your relatives, but really don't have a good relationship with them. So the issue is 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 this young girl is by herself. She is now with an uncle, and then she's engaged with these eunuchs. Haggai is the first eunuch that she's with, who who she also establishes a relationship, and she finds favor with him. She establishes and gets favor with him. And then there's these other two eunuchs who are in the picture that we read about. It's interesting because they're all marginalized people. All right, they're all suffering. It's like sometimes when we forget the commonalities that we have, and we end up at times at each other, the people who are marginalized. What marginalized just means that you are not sort of the main culture, or the main ethnic group. Like in America, for many years, European Americans that we've called white, because white also is a construct, but they were the dominant sort of people group in terms of numbers, in terms of their influence, in terms of what they bring, their culture, and all of that. Of course, now that is really changing, and that's why we see a lot of the uproar that we have now, because they know change is coming, that America is browning, as they call the term, because there are more people of color that are producing children, that are growing in population, along with African Americans, anyone that's non-white. So about 15, 20 years from now, this country would no longer be predominantly what we call a white country. And that's very frightening for them, because they've sort of been in this position. And that's why you see them doing various things with voter suppression and trying to stay in power as a minority group. And that's what happens a lot of times. It happened in South Africa with Afrikaans when they came into a black country and used apartheid for years to suppress the majority of people there who were Africans, indigenous Africans. And still today, there's still some of that going on, because people who are in power, nobody just going to give up power. They're going to fight for it. But the thing I want you to look at too tonight, because the thought I want us to kind of wrap our heads around, is fighting a common enemy. Because sometimes, if we're not careful, we being people who are marginalized, people who are not a part of the dominant culture, people of other subgroups, like in America, we have many of them in terms of you have African Americans, you have Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, you have Mexicans, Cubans, El Salvadorian Cubans, and you have all these people who are what we can see ethnic. And I hate the term minority, but that's what some of you understand, ethnic minorities. And we have the same problems, but a lot of times we are so fractured. And what the enemy does, who we should be fighting, in the system, we end up fighting each other. And that a lot of that is sort of orchestrated too to keep us at each other's throats. And so when you look at this text, you got Esther, who's a Jew, who's a marginalized woman. You got Mordecai, who's also a Jew, and then in turn, it seems to be no sort of conversation between these eunuchs in terms of Haggai and Shagaz. And now there are two other eunuchs that are going to be introduced, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of conversation in terms of their enemy, which is the Persian Empire, along with its king. Now, it's something eunuchs too. You understand that these people were marginalized. And my good friend, Dr. Rick Carson, he's a colleague of mine, and he did a PhD dissertation on particularly the eunuch in Acts. But he talks about eunuchs were typically recruited among young boys captured in slave raids or other military operations. They were boys sold by peasants to agents of the palace. In addition to boys were castrated in youth. Sometimes men were punished by being castrated as adults. Now, all eunuchs were not castrated, but many of them were. And once they had moved into the circle court, these eunuchs typically lost contact with their families, their region, or their origin. Now, think about this. Now, Esther is an orphan who has been adopted by Mordecai. She's being made the queen, right? But there's no discussion about, of course, her parents are deceased, but all these other women that were brought and lived in these harems taken away from their families. And also with Esther, there's, right now it's that she's kind of hiding who she's really connected to in terms of Mordecai, but it really is cutting her off too from her people. It's like these eunuchs. When they serve the king, they're being cut off from their families, from their regions where they grew up. And think about it, what we deal with today in our own country. How some people say, well, in Mordecai we read he got a position in the empire. The eunuchs, of course, they had positions. Esther's been made a queen, but they're still in the empire. What we fail to realize a lot of times, we have made strides in an oppressive system, and we sometimes forget that we ought to be fighting for full liberation, and we get satisfied with the crumbs and the nice car and a nice house and a retirement, but the system is still what it is. It is what it is. It's still a system that's repressive. It's a system that's built on domination. It's a system that's built on militarism. It's a system that crushes anyone that is considered to be a threat to dismantling that system. So there's a system or a better system that's put in place that's more equitable for everybody, not just for a few, but just equitable for everybody. So sometimes we forget, even in America, is we'll say, oh, we got a great country, but we forget that we're in the empire. And also, they often tell us forget our history as if it doesn't mean anything. I was having this conversation with some guy, I don't know who he was, on the internet, and it was just, I had been listening to a lecture and made a comment about standardized tests. And why the numbers in African Americans don't always do that well. The Mexican Americans and this, that, and the third. And I was saying, standardized tests, who decides? I asked him a question because he wanted to go back and forth and talk, well, you never answered my question. Why? And I did answer his question. I said, the test is biased. And of course, we've had, pockets of people who've done well on the test. But why should, we should anybody be subjected to a test when it says it's standardized based on whose standard? And it's already been proven because those tests are very subjective, and it really doesn't matter measure knowledge. Many schools are starting to throw them out, and if I would be honest tonight, I didn't do well on standardized tests, but it had nothing to do with my intelligence. 3 degrees later, I'm fine. But if I would have sort of been dependent on what a standardized test said about me, I wouldn't have applied anywhere and would have given up long time ago. So the thing is, when we look at who's telling the stories, who is helping to shape what our history looks like, and here in this text, you got Mordecai, and I'm almost finished. Just give me a few more minutes tonight. But here's Mordecai. He's been appointed, and the question I asked, he discovers that there's a plot in verse 21. He says, during the time that Mordecai held an office in the palace, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the palace eunuchs who guarded the entrance to the king's rooms, became hostile to King Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. Think about this. These are marginalized people. They both are. One has a plan that, look, we need to get to this man because he's causing us harm. A lot of the eunuchs had to live in what they call colonies. They couldn't live within their families, and they weren't necessarily living in the necessarily palace. They were there a lot of times as guards. They were doing different work. They had to be loyal. That was how they were able to be successful in terms of being loyal. But they were marginalized, and he was marginalized. And in his mind, we'll read it later on in the story next week, he's also looking to do something against this king. And you would think, why? And I asked the question of this text, why would he want to have these persons killed? Why sometimes when marginalized people on either side, it's like, maybe this example, you can have poor people, and the commonality is that they're all poor. It doesn't matter if they're African American, if they're from the Appalachians or European American, it could be Scottish, call them white, but they're poor. A Mexican or Latinx, poor, some even Asian poor. People think they're all Asian people are rich. They're not, but poor. You got indigenous Indians, poor. So the common theme or the commonality is that they all are poor, right? But the challenge is that the marginalized people sometimes forget who the enemy is. And we always seem to fall for the okie doke, and we turn on each other while the enemy plays these various groups against each other. Remember Fred Hampton as the chairman of the Black Panther Party in Chicago at age 20 before he died at age 21 by COINTELPRO, which is counterintelligence program that was run by the FBI to kill anybody they thought that was going to be a black messiah. Think about that. Go read about it. And he understood, though, the power of poor and marginalized people unifying. And he worked to unify desperate community-based groups across Chicago, forming alliances across racial and ethnic lines, way before Jesse started talking about the Rainbow Coalition. Maybe Jesse got it from him. But the thing about it is he would go into these meetings with these poor white folks, poor European American folks, and some of the Black Panther Party members didn't like it. But in some of these, the whites, he went into these meetings, sometimes they would have the Confederate flag and other kinds of stuff. But his thing was, what he got them to understand, our enemy, we really shouldn't be enemies. We've got a common enemy, and it's this system of capitalism. It's this system of police brutality. It's this system of waging war against those who have been disenfranchised already. If we could find a way to connect, and because he would tell them stuff like, he said, your apartments are not being taken care of. You're living, you have a slumlord like we do. You're paying too much for water. You're paying too much for electricity, just like we are. So if we could come together in what he called a rainbow coalition, then we can fight our enemy. We have a common enemy. Sometimes we don't realize that we can organize and we can get ourselves around things and understand we have a common enemy and not fight each other. So in this case, what I'm baffled about in this text, and maybe some of you, I know you would be, you're brilliant biblical scholars, and you would say, well, Mordecai was just more interested in the Hebrew people, nobody else. But I would really struggle, and I'm challenging this text to say, why wouldn't he sort of join hands with these eunuchs? Why wouldn't he have met with them and said, look, man, it's going to come a time where we can work together? And really, we're not even given a reason why he did it. Now, somebody can that you can project, or you can sort of think that maybe he's doing it so he could get favor. But why is it that he needs favor on his own, when these eunuchs could have helped them when the time came? And all of this, as we'll sort of read later, all of this sort of uh, heat and weight wouldn't be put on Esther's shoulders to do something for her people, when they could have all been working together, the eunuchs and all those who had been dispossessed and all those who had been disenfranchised. So I want you to just really think about this text tonight, and let me read the letter. It's fighting a common enemy. And sometimes, even when you're on a job like they're doing down in Bessemer, Alabama, trying to unionize, because all of us, Amazon is a huge company, but they have to learn. Workers have to learn to pull together, whether they're teacher unions or trucker unions, or now they're trying to or nursing units, because we can see that when you leave CEOs and boards unchecked, they do some harmful things. No health care, poor wages, poor working conditions, and the list goes on and on. They can't police each other, just like the police department cannot police itself. All right, that's enough for tonight. Listen, I want to give you an opportunity, if you so desire tonight, to give an offering to our church. I want to thank you all for supporting what we do in our ministry, for praying for us. And you can give through Cash App, or you can give through Givelify. Those two methods you can give. And whatever amount, it could be $5, it could be $10. And also pray for us. We also are collecting eyeglasses. And you can go to our website, which is thevillagedc.church. And you could send a message, and you can send those eyeglasses to the church. And I think Elder Jackie will post her address, so she'll get it. She'll make sure you can get it to her. But we are collecting eyeglasses, so we want to give these eyeglasses so they'll be repurposed so other people can use them. Don't forget, on Sunday, it's Easter. We'll meet at our regular time virtually at 9 a.m. and I will run our service twice, 9 and 11. Listen, thank you all so much for joining me tonight, and keep me in prayer, keep each other in prayer, and keep this country in prayer. All right? Have a wonderful and blessed evening.